Welcome to the 2021 UNC Water and Health Conference, and thank you for joining this afternoon session. My name is Amanda Lai from the Water Institute here at UNC, and I'll be your room host today. Before we begin with our posters, we do have a couple announcements. So first, we invite you to connect with your colleagues or a sponsor at a networking event. These are held daily at 3:30 to 5 via Remo. Next, we invite you to join us for the late early show. The first one takes place if you're on Eastern time, like many of us are. It'll be 7 a.m. on Tuesday. It'll be doctors McCullough and Salzberg who are going to be sharing their thoughts on how to apply some of today's lessons to the South Asia region. This session is being recorded for folks who cannot attend the live session. Everyone but the presenters have been muted. And please type all questions into the chat tab on the conference platform Pathable within our session today. The Zoom chat, it has been disabled. We have 4 presentations today listed here, and we'll start now with our first presentation. First, we have Ms. Jenny Lamb, who will present about the emotional and technical ethnographic field work among the humanitarian response teams. So Jenny, I'll hand it over to you right now.
Hello everyone, a real pleasure to be here today. My name is Jenny Lamb and I have a background in WASH. I carried out this ethnographic research in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. I firstly like to thank the Rohingya and the Bangladeshi community, Rahima, my translator, my tutor, and Oksam, who hosted and funded this research. Now, before we launch into the subject of this poster, I'd like you all to take a step back and think about the following questions. Now, when you last used a public toilet, what did you like or dislike about this experience? What would the perfect toilet look like for you? Imagine you being displaced from your home, like the Rohingya. How would you like to be consulted when response actors wish to understand your needs and preferences? What would be important to you, both in the short and long term? And how many of you have used a toilet in the field you have designed and built for people affected by humanitarian crises? And thank you. So we'll park these questions and we'll come back to them during the Q&A if you have some time. Okay, so now we'll proceed to the deep dive of the ethnographic fieldwork, which calls for WASH staff to have a balance of both emotional and technical intelligence to really ensure we safeguard the well-being, dignity and health of the Rohingya and other crisis-affected populations. And the reason for this call for action is explained in the following. Sadly, as we all well know, the Rohingya are one of the most persecuted minority groups in the world, with 1.25 million displaced in Bangladesh. The separation of social spaces in respect of gender roles and relations is critically important for the Rohingya, but the camp environment, scale and speed and the WASH response quashed this. The Rohingya used a metaphor often in the discussions I had with them. We are floating, to describe their predicament, as they felt neither they belonged in Bangladesh or Myanmar, that the consultation by WASH staff was transactional and rather tokenistic, that women and girls did not like going to the latrine as they did not like knowing men were watching them or could be waiting outside, plus much more. Their environmental stresses included latrines are built too far from their shelter, on steep sides, are equipped with no privacy screens, locks, lighting, and nor were gender
Hi, sorry, we're having some
Hello,
technical
everyone.
difficulties.
A real pleasure to be here today. My name is Jenny Lamb and I have a background in WASH. I carried out for women and girls to move around, whilst their sexual stresses included fear of gender-based violence, compromised privacy and dignity, and meeting unmarried men whilst at the latrine. So the women and girls had to resist and invest in their own latrines inside their shelter, either through a bucket, a small hole in the ground, or they limited their food and intake, or they visited in groups or during dusk and dawn each day. Now, the WASH staff acknowledge the following. Engineers race ahead, leaving behind the hygiene promotion staff. We only had time to ask where to locate the latrines, not about the intricacies of the design. While someone else said staff lack an understanding of the social construct and emotional burden in WASH. It's not just about building toilets, but also emotional anxiety too, i.e. the pressure of getting to the toilet before anyone else and being seen. So in short, the sanitation or the Rohingya suffers from social nakedness. The scale, speed and competencies of the WASH staff have stripped the Rohingya of their social values, humanity and dignity. Going to the toilet is a basic need and right was one of the most risky and emotional activities that the Rohingya women and girls deal with every day. Yet the Rohingya demonstrate their own agency, tenacity and resourcefulness by substituting their own sanitation infrastructure in the camp. Now, the endpoint of a purely technical lens in WASH is a compromised public health and dignified environment for the women and girls and their families. So the key takeaways from this research is that WASH staff must ensure a comprehensive understanding of Rohingya life, both in Myanmar and Bangladesh, and how this should underpin from the outset the design and implementation of WASH interventions. To build depth and meaning rather than a vast and shallow set of perspectives, to put aside that technical lens and open your eyes and ears, be empathetic and responsive. I too am a WASH engineer and wish to seek the commitment of us all to embrace the social, cultural and emotional aspects rather than only a technocentric one. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Bye.
Hi, thanks. Sorry for bearing with us through that minor technical difficulty. Now we have designated 5 minutes for Q&A with Jenny. If there are more questions, because I know that was just kind of a stop in the middle, we could allow maybe an additional minute of Q&A. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to just populate in the Pathable tab, the chat tab in there, because the chat in this Zoom has been disabled. And while we're waiting for some questions to roll in, Jenny, if you wanted to clarify on any of the points that may have been interrupted, we have a couple minutes for clarification.
Sure thing. I think some of the audio was just interrupted when I talked about the different psychosocial stressors. So we had different variety of which then led to behavior regulation from the Rohingya. So there was environmental stressors and the social stressors and sexual stressors. So I think we lost the audio on the social one. So yeah, some of the Rohingya expressed, lack of privacy, dignity, and the social restrictions for the women and girls to move around, which is a custom, belief and practice for the Rohingya. So some of these were the, endemic issues that the response did not respond to in a coherent and meaningful way from the outset. So really, yeah, it's just sort of showcasing really that, with just some time and energy and focus and engagement with communities, we really need to make sure we understand the social construct and really, WASH for many is, it's has a burden, has an emotional burden. So we need to really put ourselves in the shoes of communities and really understand, what their preferences are, how they want to be consulted, have we built that fit for purpose, perfect toilet or not? And really, it's not a one size fits all solution, but also you need to be ensuring that you consult on a progressive process. So not just consulting one time, but you need to go back and get that feedback. So it's a reiterative process. So yeah, those are my reflections. So any questions, welcome, or can come at the end of the poster session too. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. While we're waiting on questions to roll in, I think we can move forward with the second poster presenter. And again, we can come back through the chat box if there are additional questions. So next up, we have Dr. Patrick Mirindi. Today, I'll be posting his posters entitled Child Hand Contamination and its Association with Pediatric Diarrhea in Rural Democratic Republic of Congo. So we'll go ahead and show his poster now.
So we are presenting one paper on the REDUCE program, which is entitled Child Hand Contamination is Associated with Pediatric Diarrheas in Rural Democratic Republic of the Congo. The objective, the REDUCE enteropathy, undernutrition and contamination in the environment REDUCE study focuses on identifying exposure pathway to fecal pathogen for young children in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and on developing scalable intervention to reduce fecal contamination from these pathways. A prospective study of 690 participants was conducted to investigate the association between hand, food, and environmental fecal contaminant and diarrhea diseases prevalence among young children in Walungu territory in South Kivu in DRC. A total of more than 1,900 hand rinse, soil, food, fomites, stored water source sample were collected during an announced spot check after baseline environment and analyzed for Escherichia coli. Caregiver reported or reports of diarrhea were obtained from children under 5 at 6 months follow-up. As a result, Escherichia coli were detected in 73% of children and child caregivers handling samples, 69% also sample from child play spaces, 54% of child food samples, 38% of surfaces, fomites, and object. Children were observed putting in their mouth 70% of stored water samples and 40% of sources water samples. Children under 5 with Escherichia coli on the hand had significantly higher odds of diarrhea at 6 months follow-up, with an odds ratio of 2.303, ranging from 1.05 to 3.92. In conclusion, children hand contamination is associated with diarrheal diseases in DRC, and that there is a high fecal contamination in child's play spaces and food. This finding provides evidence demonstrating the urgent need to provide clean play spaces for young children and intervention targeting hand hygiene to reduce pediatric exposure to fecal contaminant. Thank you for following. I'm open to question, if any.
So we'll wait on some questions to roll in. Dr. Mirindi, I have a specific technical question as a microbiologist. What were your methods processing the handwritten samples downstream? I missed that.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So for the hand rinse, we the method was simple. We put some PBS into a wheel pack and we rinsed all the hand of each participant into the hand rinse. And over time, at each spot check, we collected those hand rinse and take it to the lab on ice and processed it for E. coli and other germs, mostly E. coli for this study. Thanks.
Thank you. And Dr. Mirindi, and for the rest of the presenters following, would you mind sharing your slides during this Q&A session? I think that may facilitate some questions as well. Thank you. Okay, we have one question from Rachel. Could you provide any insight into the relative concentrations of E. coli in the different samples?
Okay. Of course, yes. So for this study, we didn't present the details on the relative concentration. And so the paper is online for now, and they may, so the E. coli for, so for the mean in E. coli into different, let's say for soy, because we use the MPN, the most probable number. So for the E. coli in soy, it was around 4,000 per gram, because per gram. For food, it ranged around, this is the mean. For food, it ranged around 200 MPN per gram of dry food. For surfaces, we were around 100 per object or per 100 square meters. And same for formite, which range up to 426 MPM per meter. So I think that's most of the surfaces which we presented in this paper. And for hands specifically, the E. coli concentration, because it was hand rinse, the mean E. coli was around 112 MPN per 100 ml of rinse water.
Thank you. All right. Well, I think now would be a good time to move on to the next presenter. So Dr. Mirindi, if you could stop sharing the screen. Next up, we'll welcome Kelsey Shaw with the University of Victoria. She'll be presenting her poster entitled Non-sewered Sanitation Systems and Greenhouse Emissions, Trade-offs amongst SDGs to End Open Defecation.
Discharge of untreated waste into the environment and the use of decentralized on-site sanitation technologies such as septic tanks, pit latrines, and ecological sanitation variants like container-based sanitation contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, but have remained poorly quantified. The purpose of this analysis was to investigate the impacts that meeting Sustainable Development Goal 6.2, i.e. ending open defecation by 2030, would have on SDG 13, combating climate change impacts. The current Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change greenhouse gas estimation methodology was used as the basis for calculations in this analysis, augmented with improved emission factors from collected data sets for all on-site sanitation infrastructure. Specifically, this assessment focused on the 3 different service levels of sanitation: improved, unimproved, and no service, as defined by the Joint Monitoring Program, as they pertain to 3 shared socioeconomic pathways. This analysis considered the 100-year global warming potential values of all 3 greenhouse gases, methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide, that can be emitted in carbon dioxide equivalents for each scenario in decentralized sanitation technology. Ultimately, 6 scenarios were developed for various combinations of pathways and sanitation technologies. There was significant variability between the scenarios, with results ranging from 68 teragrams of CO2 equivalents per year in scenario 1A to 7 teragrams of CO2 equivalents per year in scenario 3B, as you can see here in this figure. The main contributors of greenhouse gas emissions in each scenario was demonstrated to be septic tank systems and pit latrines. Although in scenarios that utilized improved emission factors, these emissions were significantly reduced compared to those using only standard IPCC emission factors. This analysis demonstrated that using field-based experimental emission factors reduced estimated greenhouse gas emissions within each SSP scenario on average by 53%. The results indicate that achieving the SDG's sanitation targets can significantly affect environmental impacts in the form of global greenhouse gas emissions. Additionally, there is a need for continued improvement and collection of field-based emission estimations to refine coarse-scale emission models, as well as better characterization of relevant biodegradation mechanisms in popular forms of on-site sanitation systems. An increase in the understanding of sanitation and climate change linkages among stakeholders can ultimately lead to better inclusion of sanitation and other basic human rights and climate action goals. Thank you so much.
Thanks. And Kelsey, if you could share your screen, perfect. Thank you. Great. We can just wait a couple more minutes for questions to trickle in. All right, we got a question. Kelsey, can you tell us a little more about the field-based emission factors that were used? Which factors were you able to find field data for specifically?
Yeah, hopefully everyone can hear me. Great question. So the field-based emission factors, ideally, what my original plan was before the world ended in 2020 was to collect these emission factors myself in the field from septic tank systems in Canada and augment existing data sets. Unfortunately, that didn't happen according to plan. And so the field-based emission factors that I was able to find, there weren't that many of them. Most were limited to a handful of studies on septic tank systems, a lot of them coming out of the United States, as well as pit latrine systems sort of scattered throughout Southeast, not Southeast Asia, it's late here, South Africa, as well as some a few lab-based studies based out of Southeast Asia for septic tank systems. And so looking at sort of the variety that those studies presented, as well as the significantly less lower amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we were seeing from all of these field-based studies compared to the emission factors in the IPCC report, was kind of the major takeaway from that. I think there's a lot more refinement that needs to happen, and ideally I would eventually like to refine it with my own data. But I think the major takeaway from this is that right now the IPCC methodology is kind of grossly overestimating a lot of the contributions from these sanitation systems. And the takeaway from that is that these systems, I think, sometimes are cast in a bit of a bad light when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. Yes, they are contributors, but they're also providing people with access to a basic human right. And then secondly, it sort of underlines the fact that we still don't know a lot about how these systems are operating when it comes to the anaerobic processes that are producing like a lot of these greenhouse gases. So I think it highlights this gap in knowledge that is still there. So hope that kind of answers that.
Yeah, thanks, Kelsey. We have time for one more question. But we can also, we do have one more question. How much more greenhouse gases are there from pit latrines and septic compared to container-based sanitation?
Great question. So the sort of scale of this analysis, the core scale of this analysis, I wouldn't be able to say with a high degree of accuracy what that difference is. This was more looking at sort of bigger scale scenarios where using the 3 different SSP scenarios of how much of the global population would have access to either just open defecation, so those who are openly defecating now, if they transferred over to sort of limited services, which is a combination of container-based, septic, and pit, versus just safely managed services, what those differences would be. So with a high degree of accuracy, I couldn't answer off the top of my head. What I can say is that because of the nature of septic tank systems and pit latrines, just looking at the system itself, so we're not talking about the greenhouse gas emissions that go into the actual like transportation emissions that you would get from container-based, that's sort of outside of the scope of this, but just the system itself, the main contributors are methane and nitrous oxide, and you're going to see the largest amounts of that coming from sort of your traditional, what are assumed anaerobic environments, so your septic tank system, as well as your pit latrine. If that sort of answers that.
Thanks, Kelsey. Again, if there are additional questions, feel free to continue populating the chat box. We do need to move on to our next poster presentation though. And you guys are free to collaborate in the chat box. We'll also have this chat or this Zoom session open for an extra 10 minutes after the allotted time. So next, let's welcome Miss Edna Samuel and Dr. Rachel Peletz, who join us from the Acquia Institute. They'll be presenting their poster entitled "Can Subsidies Promote Safe Pit Emptying Practices in Low-Income Areas of Kenya?"
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this presentation on subsidy.
Sorry, bear with
and
us.
safe pit emptying practices in low-income areas of Kisumu, Kenya. My name is Edna Samuel with the Acquire Institute, and today I'm presenting on behalf of my
Sorry
colleague,
about this.
Rachel Peletz. This research was funded by Water and Sanitation for the Urban Poor under the Urban Sanitation Research Initiative. On to the introduction. In Kisumu, majority of the households use on-site sanitation facilities, and emptying of these facilities is primarily done by informal manual emptiers who want safely empty, transport, and dispose of waste in waterways or bury it on-site. Efforts to improve safe emptying include the use of vacuum truck operators and formal manual emptiers that have been trained and recognized by the local authorities to safely empty, transport, and dispose of fecal waste. However, vacuum truck operators are rarely used in low-income areas because they are perceived to be expensive, unable to access dense settlements, and not designed to remove solid waste found in pit latrines. In addition, low-income residents lack information about these service providers, and they are not willing to pay market prices. So to assess the market for safe fecal waste emptying services in low-income areas of Kisumu, we engaged 3 different managing groups, namely Vukasasa, the Association of Vacuum Truck Operators, and Nyalenda Water Association, to coordinate and incentivize safe pit emptying activities. Vukasasa is a community-based organization providing safe manual pit emptying, while the Nyalenda Water is a small-scale water supplier providing water in low-income areas with no previous experience in sanitation. The managing groups were responsible for finding their own customers, setting their prices, and ensuring that they provide high-quality services within their designated geographical zones. The responsibilities for each group are represented by the direction of the arrows in the pilot structure figure. The managing groups received an average of $24 from customers, and Acquire provided an additional $30 cash incentive to managing groups for each emptying job completed. And for the formal emptying services transport cost, we also provided a $20 cash incentive per trip to transport fecal sludge to the treatment site. As well, the utility waived the dumping fees during the pilot. For each of the managing groups, we then collected data to assess their financial and safe emptying performance, as well as customer satisfaction. In terms of the results, during the 2-month pilot, 194 toilets were emptied, with most toilets being pit latrines. The Association of Vacuum Truck Operators coordinated the most emptying jobs and removed the highest volume of fecal sludge. As well, the Association of Vacuum Truck Operators was the most financially viable, and the average price of $14 per job charged by the association was substantially lower, and their total profit was higher compared to the other 2 managing groups. In terms of customer satisfaction, most customers were satisfied with the safe emptying services, and satisfaction was highest for the Association of Vacuum Truck Operators. The dark blue color in the bar graph represents the proportion of customers that are willing to use the same service at the same price. Thus, the Association of Vacuum Truck Operators demonstrated the greatest success in coordinating incentivized emptying services, both in the number of pits emptied and the number of trips required to transport fecal sludge to the treatment site. The strong performance of the association was likely driven by its higher capacity for performing jobs through its membership of vacuum truck operators, higher customer satisfaction, lower operating costs compared to manual emptying, their experience in marketing the services, and accurate record keeping. Most of the association's jobs were performed by its vacuum truck operator members, while some emptying jobs were subcontracted to former manual emptying organizations. This arrangement demonstrates that productive collaboration between the vacuum truck operators and formal manual emptying organizations are a useful model for improving proper service delivery. And finally, it's evident that safe emptying services are often unaffordable at the current market prices and will likely require some form of subsidies and political action to service low-income areas. Thank you.
Okay. Great. Now, if Edna could, if you could share your poster to all. Thank you. We're just waiting on questions to roll in. And for those of you who are unable to see some of the posters from earlier, if you look in the pathable box where our chat box is, on the top tab files, you can rewatch any of the poster sessions or look at the posters as PDF. And while we wait for questions, we have a couple minutes left. Oh, we do have questions now. Okay, I'm just going to read this entire contextual sentence as well. I'm guessing the customers of manual emptiers and truck operators were quite different. If that's right, how does this affect the comparisons made?
Thanks, Amanda. I don't know, Edna, if your internet is good enough to answer that one, or you'd like me to jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. So I would say both the customers of the different models of service provision that we were trying out were not different, because all of them were coming from the same low-income areas, or pretty, they come from a similar socioeconomic characteristics.
Thank you. And we have one more question for you, Edna. Do you have any idea how the cost of subsidies for pit emptying compares to subsidies provided for piped sanitation in comparable settings?
I think Rachel can go ahead and answer that one.
Thanks, Louis. Good question. I mean, the short answer is I don't know off the top of my head what the subsidies are for pipe sanitation in that, in this setting. I'm just trying to think. Maybe it's somewhat similar. I remember, when I lived in Nairobi, learning that my sanitation was about 50% subsidized. So, just looking at these numbers, the customers were paying $24 on average. We were subsidizing $30. So, it's somewhat comparable, you could say, just as a, very high level.
Thanks, Rachel. And now I'm actually going to open up the floor to questions about any of the 4 poster presentations we just saw. We have about 4 minutes left. So I'm going to ask Kelsey one question that was directed at her. Kelsey, are you able to comment on the total greenhouse gas emissions from pits and septic tanks when you take the whole service chain into account? So also considering emissions from pumping, trucking waste, treatment, et cetera.
Based on the analysis that I've presented here today, no, no, I am not. That was outside of the scope of my analysis, but I think it's worth stating that it's very important to consider the whole service chain when you're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, especially from decentralized sanitation. But for the purposes of this analysis, again, it was mostly to sort of highlight where these key gaps are when we're talking about sort of moving away from open defecation and meeting these sort of like broad sweeping sanitation goals and what that can look like kind of moving forward globally. But I think there's a lot more work to be done and a lot of important work already being done looking at the full service chain. I just personally cannot comment on it, but it's a great question.
Thanks, Kelsey.
Maybe while we're waiting, I can just jump into to follow up on that question from Andres on the different customers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks. But yeah, manual emptiers. So the formal manual emptiers, in theory, I know there's a question of were the customers different. I mean, in theory, they're able to potentially access, harder to reach places in low income settings where vacuum trucks maybe couldn't navigate. One interesting thing that we found though was that the Association of Vacuum Truck Operators were subcontracting to the formal emptying groups when they needed to. So even though they, if they had places they can access themselves, they were still managing those jobs. So in some ways, they could almost act like a switchboard to kind of bring in different groups where needed.
Thanks, Rachel. That actually puts us right at time, and it looks like we've addressed all the questions in the chat box for now. Again, feel free to continue collaborating. This Zoom will stay open for another 10 minutes. Otherwise, this concludes the poster presentations. Thank you, guys.